welcome to Too Much Music,
a show where two music know-it-alls talk about making music in a world
that probably already has a little too much music in it.
Allow me to introduce Alison. She's an indie hero who's written thousands of songs and can rock a pedal board like nobody's business.
But I also have graduate degrees in music theory and know quite a bit about how the brain processes music. And this here is Greg. He's a legitimate conservatory-trained doctor of music who can conceive of musical sounds that we mere mortals can't even comprehend.
Okay, yeah, but I'm also an old-school 80s goth, and I'm currently living on the road and producing music out of a studio that I built in my RV.
We used to be married.
But now, we just have this podcast. Okay, now we're rolling. So now we gotta get back up to it. Okay, intro's rolling. Good.
Well, hello there, everyone.
Hello. Welcome
Too Much Music?
Back. Season 2.
Season 2? Did we really have a season 1?
Well, in a manner of speaking. It's been a while.
For those of you watching on YouTube, you'll see my hair has grown quite a bit. That couldn't have happened overnight. So yeah, Greg, what you been up to, man?
I have been recording and releasing lots of music. Many different collections of music, singles, all manner of styles and genre. Lots of music. And I've also been learning how to split wood to warm my cabin, my humble cabin, next winter. Yeah, that's what I've been doing. How about you?
Yeah, so I released an album as Blix Bird, and that took a couple years. I was working on that, already at the time we did our last podcast episode. It hasn't been quite that long. But I did release it. I'm very happy with it. I'm excited about it. I am excited it's done and I can do new things. Got a second dog. That's Pepper. She's a little black speck back behind me for those of you on YouTube.
Peps.
Yeah. Become an avid gardener. That's exciting. I know everyone wants to hear about that. Maybe we should spend a few minutes talking about the
rhododendrons. Let's talk about it. No.
Hydrangea.
This is called Too Much Music. There's too much of it. So we're going to keep releasing music, adding to the pile, and not talking about gardening or golf.
Okay, well then, if we're not... Who's talking about golf anyway? I don't know what golf has to do with gardening. They start with the G.
If you keep gardening, you're going to end up golfing. You're going to end up playing croquet. You're going to become a Heather. I don't know.
I did just get a croquet set.
Oh my God.
A wooden one too.
Well, I would like to play, and you can. I want to try it. Okay. You're going to need to keep your lawn short and the. Okay. Anyway.
All right. So yeah, nix the gardening. Moving to music. Our topic today is one that is a bit fraught and complicated and difficult.
We don't shy away from controversy. In fact, I think that's a hallmark.
Yeah, it sometimes can be even emotional. At least it has been in the past for me, because this is a conversation that that Greg and I have been having since we met each other in 2008, 2009 is when we first knew each other.
2008, 7 or 8, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, it's been a minute since we met, and the first probably 5 years of knowing each other, we had this conversation in a pretty combative way often.
Which was?
Well, the conversation is about the differences between what we'll call, and we'll define these, don't worry, art music and pop music. So, just a tiny short background, Greg and I have both had quite a bit of musical training in the kind of typical way. Greg went all the way through a doctorate in the conservatory. He went to Eastman. Doesn't get more legitimate than that. And I went through a partial PhD in music theory. So I know quite a lot about Western art music, as you might call it. But I also have always been a huge and mega fan of popular music and a songwriter. I've had bands. So that's, I would say, more my formative experience is more in the pop side of things, even though I have studied a lot. So Greg and I have a common language we can use to talk about these things. And when we first started having this conversation, I was really surprised to hear Greg say that there were fundamental differences between art music and pop music. And in fact, the term pop music was even offensive to me when he would call the music that I made at the time in my band, which was, experimental indie music. That was not pop music. And I was like, that was the first line of defense that I had. It was I don't play pop music. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're going to, it took me a long time. It took me a long time to realize, don't tell him that Greg was kind of right. And a lot of conversations. So today we're going to try to condense that for you. And hopefully, with a little bit less wailing and gnashing of teeth than we may have had. Sometimes the conversations were fun. Sometimes, and I will admit that I would often get defensive about it. And today,
the danger, and I think we want to be really careful because this is not how either one of us feels. It has not. The danger is that one is going to be dismissed, as trite or simple or I don't know, something lesser than.
Which one do you think would be dismissed as trite?
Well, it's the one that everyone does, right? They say songwriting and pop music is trite, and that's just not the case. How do I know? Because I've actually spent some time in the last couple of years trying to do it myself. And I would say with extremely limited, marginal results. And I'm a competent musician I can do many things over a wide range of styles. But the problem isn't that. The problem is I don't really understand. It doesn't live within me. It doesn't speak to me. I never loved it. So while I can identify the things that pop music does that art music doesn't, they don't speak to me in the same way, and so it doesn't come out in any way. It doesn't come out with any meaning or personal value, authenticity. Sure. So anyway, it's not simple. It's not trite. Absolutely not the case. And we're not going to talk about it that way because it's not how either of us feel through experience.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for saying that, because that is really important, and I think that did get lost in our early conversations about this topic. Greg and I both may have matured somewhat in our time as friends, and then business partners, and then spouses, and now friends again.
And we're only 30. We're just 30 now, so it's pretty great.
I'm totally Gen Z. Don't look at me. Yeah, so first, we're only 7 minutes in, and we're going to define, we're going to define the title of our episode. So, so what do we mean by art music and pop music? Because that actually will set the stage for the rest of the conversation. So I'll start with popular music, and we're going to define them today by their lineage. And the definitions that we come up with are going to leave out a lot of music in the world. So I'll just put that disclaimer out there. We're not talking about everything. We're talking about the two types of music that Greg and I both have a massive amount of experience with. So that is, pop music is short for popular, but that word doesn't really do it justice or mean much of anything. It's really just a shorthand. And what I'm talking about today, when I'm talking about popular music, is I'm talking about music in the lineage of blues music from the American South from basically the early 20th century. So everything that I'm considering really does come out of that. That's not its only influence. Caveat, but that lineage is what we're really dealing with. And there's, you could do 16 episodes just on that concept, but we're going to just stop with that. So Greg, what about the lineage of what we're calling today, just for the sake of being pithy, art music?
So art music, in this case, concert music, you might call it. So it's a Western, very white Western tradition, male-dominated tradition that through Europe. I mean, through Europe and into America, sort of. But it's a European tradition. We're talking about Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, Monteverdi, Josquin, all the way through modern composers, Stockhausen. And I want to get into probably some of so people talk about modern crossover, and I think that's an interesting place we'll get to, but I think these are very different lineages in terms of the things we'll discuss, the language of the music, the performance practice, the role in culture, all the things that we'll discuss. But I think that they actually develop along very separate paths. And the reason it's important to distinguish the two at all is because knowing what you're doing and what's come before you will keep you from reinventing the wheel, and it will also provide material for you to invent upon, shoulders for you to stand on, so to speak. And if you're just groping, harmonically, let's say, to try and find something you think sounds fresh, you're probably not going to succeed at doing that. And secondly, it's worth knowing in detail the lineage that has come before you, because that music has had success. It's the reason that you know about it today after decades or hundreds of years is because it has survived. People have found it worth repeating. So
and probably you as a musician, if you're a musician listening to this and your goal is to make better music, like ours is, seeing things with clear eyes can be just mind-blowingly helpful, especially when it's music that has been influential for you, already in some way. It's important to you. It has moved you. Being crystal clear about where it comes from and how it works, and this is why I studied music theory personally. I wanted to be crystal clear about all the music that I loved so much, and how, specifically how it worked in great painstaking detail. Yeah. So, and I want to keep coming back to this question as we go through the rest of the episode. Why is this even a question why is this a conversation that you would have? Why does anyone care about this distinction? Because I think that's a very important question. And I do think there are a lot of different answers to it that might be helpful, and they will come through in context. So I want to structure this conversation by looking at some different traits and characteristics of music, some kind of broad traits. And I'm going to just bear with me for a second here. I spent some time recently, because I was curious, reading just, a little bit about autism spectrum disorder. Yes, that's a left turn. But it really taught me something, and I think it's relevant here. So what this is coming from is an article called that I found on a site called neuroclastic.com, and I'll try to put a link in all the show notes and the blah blahs. And the title of the article is Autism Spectrum Disorder. It doesn't mean what you think. Got my attention. I was like, well, I think it means this. And it turns out I was actually totally wrong, and I was oversimplifying. So the point of the article basically is, when most people hear about the autism spectrum, they think of a linear spectrum from, a little quirky over here to autistic in the middle to super duper autistic over here, right? It's just like, how autistic are you? Which is exactly not what is meant by that term, autism spectrum disorder. What it actually means is that there's a collection of related neurological conditions that are intertwined. You can't really pick them apart. Professionals have stopped trying. And so when they're diagnosing, they're looking at this rainbow of traits, and they're asking questions and trying to understand for this individual person how they fit inside this rainbow of traits and characteristics. And, there might be something like 8 or 10 of these different characteristics. And if you only check 1 or 2 of those boxes, the doctors diagnosing you will not call it autism. They will call it something else. They'll look at that specific sensory processing thing or whatever. So not to get too in the weeds with that, but the idea that there's this spectrum of characteristics really resonates with me in terms of these differences between art music and pop music, because we can look at some specific areas of musical interest and think about what might the differences be, and we can think about actual music and music history and all of the things that we know and have learned over the years of studying this stuff. Overall, how does pop music fit in this particular characteristic, and how does art music usually do this? And obviously, just like in autism spectrum disorder, what we're going to find is that different pieces of music and different composers and different times and different genres and all of this stuff they have different spectrum. They're different in different places on the spectrum. And so what we want to do is get into some of those characteristics specifically and see if we can suss out, what some of those differences might be.
And I'm not going to be afraid. I mean, I think we should not be afraid to talk technically, not to the point of boring anyone. Well, I have a keyboard here, I can play some things, but the point is we want to be specific about this and not vague.
I have bad news. I'm pretty sure I just bored everyone. So I think
okay.
I think
that's okay. For
sailed.
The 2 people left, welcome. And here we go. We're going to get more technical. Buckle in.
Yeah. So we're going to start. We're going to start with 2 related traits or characteristics. We're going to start with structure and form and musical language. So these are the places. Let's go with structure and form first. So, Greg,
okay.
when you think of these differences, how do they manifest in structure and form?
Well, so the very obvious thing, and this will get into the roles, the function of these different musics. But the very obvious thing is that pop music is short. It's meant to be attention-getting right away, and it doesn't take people on a very long journey. It's a crystalline statement of some kind, right? An emotional statement, something. It's not diluted. It's a point. And so it's short. So in terms of structure and form, there are very few variations that I'm aware of. I think there was I'm not a pop music expert, but there was a period in the 70s where things were a little different, right? You could have these 10-minute long...
We're talking about prog rock here, people.
Prog rock. Yeah, okay. But I don't know enough about that to really comment, but I know that basically what I'm saying is these things are 3 to 5 minutes long, right? Pop songs in general. And art music is extremely different. It's, usually 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 40 minutes in some cases, could be 90 minutes. But the point is that the material, and we'll get into the language here in a minute, but the material required to do those 2 different, to span those 2 different time structures alone is incredibly different. The actual language and the material required to, and what's expected of that material is totally different. Okay, so in the case of craft work, for example, in terms of pop music, what you get at the beginning, you're going to hear it many times. It's not going to change in any appreciable way. It's not going to develop. It's not going to modulate to distant places. It's going to be what it is at the beginning. It's going to be a short hook that gets into your ear, and you're going to hear it a bunch of times so that hopefully when you hear that song again, you'll remember it already, right? Versus a Mahler symphony where we could start in myriad places and go anywhere, and it will, and that the material is designed to be memorable and have an identity such and be flexible so that it can adapt over time and take you on a journey emotionally.
Yeah. So in terms of form, pop music has a very limited number of forms in general that I would, there is a prototypical pop music form. There's one prototypical pop music
form. Take it to the bridge.
Yeah, right. We have verses, we have choruses, and we have a bridge, and they're almost always arranged in the same way or very close to the same way.
TBA, plug it in.
Yeah, the length of them is almost always the same. It is a really strict structure. Obviously, again, we know that many, many, many artists have played with that and done really interesting things with that and totally deviated from it. But overall,
for the most part, that works. I mean, that's part of the point, right? So I think one way I like to think about the difference, by the way, just generally in terms of form too, is pop music versus art music. Pop music is for, we'll say, partying or moving your butt or socializing. That's a lot of its social function. We'll talk about that later. But art music is for reflection. And these 2 things, again, right away, you need to deliver what you're going to deliver in the case of the pop music right up front. And in the art music world, you're going to let that develop.
And I'm going to try really hard in this episode not to do what I normally do, which is to say, well, but, which is in this case, well, but what about the sad songs? Those aren't for dancing. What we're going to try to do here is, if we were to go into every exception to what I'll call these prototypes or archetypes, is probably a better word, the archetypal pop music form or pop music purpose, this episode would be 20 years long. So we're not going to do that. We're going to try to stick with what we consider the archetypes of each of these types of music. And I think I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of that section, Greg, where you were talking about the idea of a journey versus this idea of maybe a single utterance. And I think this is a really powerful archetype and a huge difference and very interesting, which is that in most Western art music, at least up until very recently, which is a whole other ball of wax, the composer was crafting a long, I'll call it a narrative. That may be a little bold, but I'll call it a narrative. But things were going very far afield and coming back and going far afield. And all the forms did this. There wasn't a single popular form that that's confusing. There wasn't a single popular form in classical music that but you know what I mean. So
and there are exceptions, but rarely. Yeah.
So and those exceptions, interestingly, were based on folk and dance music. That's right. They're like forms. Strophic. Yeah, dance forms. And so that's actually it's like early crossover music. Oh
my goodness, minuets, getting down and dirty. Look out.
Let's get our powdered wigs, people.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so I think that great popular music has a single thing to say. So if you listen to a song, it is expressing, even if it tells a story, it's expressing one thing. Just one thing. It's not going from thing to thing to thing and coming back and weaving around. It is one, in the best case, beautiful or powerful thing that it's saying. By contrast, I like what you're saying about this in terms of the art music form, because like the definition of sonata form, I mean, the whole interest in its development over, hundreds of years really, is the complicated way to get from one place to a very far away place. How far away can that be? How many little mini journeys do we have? And it really goes far. I mean, these are distant harmonically. It goes so far that it broke. I mean, it goes so
exactly.
you can go so far that you can break it, and that's what happened in the early 20th centuries. But let's use this as a pivot. Actually, this is a very interesting moment to start talking about the language, because how do you go so far away? How do you do that as a composer if you're Schubert or Beethoven? How might you craft that journey?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll speak to that a little bit. But I want to first caveat that we're going to immediately talk about harmonic language, melodic language, but that's only a very small piece of this. We have to talk about rhythm. We have to talk about texture, timbre, and we want to talk about those in terms of pop music too, because they have very different roles there in terms of the language and what's of value. But so I would argue that in common practice music, and this is very muddy. So ultimately, when you're talking about, say, Mozart, okay, the very basic language of early Mozart, let's say, it's not basic, but the harmonic distances
it's archetypal classical language. How about that?
Thank you. And you wouldn't travel super far away in those forms harmonically. What really changed that was the mixing of modes, and specifically, I think, in a major key, in a major scale, we would lower the sixth scale degree.
I'm gonna pause.
Yeah.
Let's have just a tiny mini theory lesson that you can do on the keyboard in like 5 seconds, because I think if someone doesn't know that really the archetypal move of Western classical music is tonic, dominant, tonic, I think they'll be confused and they'll hear it in about immediately. So go. There we go. Sounds like Three Blind Mice, doesn't it? Sounds like baby music.
And I'm assuming, I was going to go a little further than that, but okay.
Well, but the point is, what Greg's talking about here is he's talking about going further away. He's talking about going further away from this this tonic area, this harmonic area that's home at any given moment. The tonic is home in any given piece. And in very earliest music, there was a tonic and a final, or the dominant, okay, in chant and in medieval music, and that gets embellished through modes and through counterpoint. This is part of the lineage that we're talking about in the language. But as common practice music developed, common practice harmony developed as a product of counterpoint, composers began to mix the modes and to specifically, I think the big move I think is to lower the sixth scale degree of a major scale, because what that does is it makes traditional tonic harmony. It allows for movement away in a very dramatic fashion. When you lower that sixth scale degree, you open the possibility for plagal cadence. Okay, so it can become okay, and that still has a very different effect.
It's a different emotion, but it's still the same function harmonically. And that was just because we lowered that scale degree. And that also will allow for things like in a major key, pivoting to the minor 3 chord. Okay, which otherwise would have to be. Okay, so these are simple examples, but that opens up the possibility to launch you into much further harmonic lands, so to speak.
So, for example, if you were starting, just a super simple example, if you're starting in C major and that's what that's the home key of your sonata movement, you might be able to travel to something like F sharp minor in this way, which is crazy in early Mozart. That would never be able to happen. But by the time you get into Beethoven and into Schubert, they had figured out methods, very clever methods that were functional, that felt basically right to everyone, although people did have a hard time with it at first, where they could go into these faraway keys. And at that time, a key was a place. A key was the key that you were in was a different space. This gets into tuning and all kinds of crazy stuff that we won't go into, but if you just think it's like the wildest place that you could go from where you are, that's what they were trying to figure out how to do. And they were
like a Doctor Who. It's like Doctor Who, right? Like every episode you can set it anywhere, or right?
Yes.
And that's not normally how a TV show might work. You would expect them to open in the living room every time before something happens. Okay.
And because of the way musical expectation works at this time that we're talking about, basically in the 19th century, you couldn't just skip over there. You couldn't just hop over there, just all of a sudden be over there. You had to do it in this clever way that made contrapuntal and musical sense in their language. Okay.
So I would like to sort of make a point here about this. If you take the very dangerous, and I would not recommend this step of searching music theory on YouTube, don't do it. You'll immediately find everyone and their brother talking about mode mixture, okay, in pop music, and they're going to get most everything they say wrong. But here's the important thing that I would say is that you can find this kind of movement in pop music, but it's used very different. This is the key here. Why are they different? Because it's used very differently. Its function is very different, the mode mixture, than it would be in art music. So let me give an example. So people usually pick Radiohead. At least people of our age.
Very popular among music theorists in the classroom.
Okay. So they pick Radiohead and they'll do something like this. They'll say, okay, and that's just what we were talking about. That's we are in a major key. And where does that come from? That's mode mixture. So we have a minor 4. And what's happening so why? It's because that feels heroic, right? It feels it's taking us away out of the norm. It's a little unexpected, but not too unexpected, right? We can't get too far afield in a pop song because it still has to contain that one thing that you're going to take away. and I would argue that has, how does Radiohead come to that? Well, maybe they're music theory buffs, or maybe also they were raised on film music, but from American film music. So by composers John Williams and such like that. So, and what they were doing.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say that the minor four has a very important history, in particular in pop music. That's become a trope, basically, and it has a certain affect. And where it came from and who first did it, I actually don't know in pop music, but it's been around almost the whole time, and it has a very strong affect that radio uses to, I think, great effect in the song "No Surprises."
And but the film composers, of the 70s and 80s certainly were studying romantic era music, the height of chromaticism in art music. And they're orchestrating it that way. So we have like John Williams.
Greg is not a Star Wars fan.
So, but my point there is that's mode mixture in exactly that same way. The way Radiohead does it, it rocks back and forth between the two. It doesn't go anywhere. But the way that John Williams or a romantic era at the height of chromaticism might use it is they might do that. But then they're going to do this, to do this, to do this. Okay, so we are in a very different place now.
Go find a pop song that does that. Yeah, you won't.
Yeah, you won't find it in pop music. It's possible you find it in a musical or in a film score. But these are not crossovers, because if you did that in a pop song, people would be very confused. It wouldn't feel authentic. You would lose the germ.
I would call it borrowing. I would say that that move in particular, and a lot of mode mixture moves, is going to the major 3 or the flat major 6, is also, those are two other popular moves. Radiohead loves both of those as well. They love borrowing this concept of mode mixture, and I think,
and again, that's in film scores all over the place. Even
super popular.
Yeah.
In musicals also, like you said. But I do think in pop music, I think that the major difference is you borrow this little tiny bit of an idea that resonates with you for whatever reason, and it creates an affect. And like Greg said,
feels emotional.
And No Surprises, it just rocks back and forth between those two chords for a very long time. And that's the hook of the whole song. That's what sets the mood. That's what sets the tone for that song. And I think the idea of repetition in general, which is one we haven't really talked about yet.
Oh, let's get to it.
Is that's one of the major points of difference.
That's part of the structure. We did talk about that a bit, but the structure, like I think Kraftwerk is a great example. Minimalist structure where the hook is very short and you're going to hear it again and again and again in almost exactly the same context, right? You're not going to get a wide range of.
This reminds me. Yeah, I did an extremely nerdy project in grad school where I looked at repetition in ABBA, and I think probably anyone who pays attention to this stuff is aware that ABBA is a magical pop group. They're a secret society that includes their name, which is ABBA. Did you notice that?
It's describing the form of pop music, and it's also a palindrome. And oh my god! Okay.
Well, but their songs, so many of their songs are. When you talk about crystalline structures, you don't get more crystalline than an ABBA song. And I was curious about why that was, and the specifics of it, as I was wont to be when I was studying music theory. And so I started looking. And I looked at Take a Chance specifically. And I didn't even get beyond that because there was enough for a pretty major graduate paper in that song. And what I was looking at was the nested repetitions. And it turns out that song has a hierarchy of nested repetitions that is about 8 to 10, I don't remember the specific number, but it's like 8 to 10 levels deep. So starting at the formal structural level and going down to the level of like 16th note repetitions, it encompasses the harmonies, it encompasses the melodies, it encompasses the rhythms. It is so crystalline in its repetition structure. And I think
I would like to point something out about that, because in terms of the creation of this, right? So, we can say, well, somebody architected that. Maybe, maybe not. Mozart, who died at a very young age, his music everywhere, even when he was a child, is 8 to 10 crystalline levels of repetition nested in this and that. It's beautiful. It's like looking at a perfect crystal all the time when you do analysis on this stuff. But he just, pardon my French, he just shat it out. He didn't think about this, not the way that you and I would or whatever. He didn't design this. There are no graphs. It just came out of him complete like this. It's not necessarily the case that someone is architecting in the way that Stockhausen might have, for example, complex relationships. So this isn't about, how much time and effort and math and brain work was going on. This is about a crystalline set of features inside the language of music, which may or may not be hearable to the audience. Go ahead.
Well, so you just kind of undercut my point, which is cool.
I didn't mean to. So, well, maybe I did.
No, let's go back to it, because that's actually really interesting. So okay. I was talking about repetition structures as a really important part of pop music.
It is.
And I kind of got on a tangent with ABBA because I have a thing.
Well, you were able to do a graduate or graduate level work on this, because it is very much something you would expect to find in Mozart or Brahms or Beethoven. You found it in a piece of pop music, which is unusual. It's very unusual. And maybe
it's unusual for it to be that clear. It's very unusual for it to be that clear. What is different about what is different about the repetition structures in that ABBA song?
Yeah.
And early Mozart really, like, it really does kick it. Like it is absolutely incredible. Yeah. But what makes those repetition structures so different? And I would say it is the simplicity of the patterns.
Yes.
So
exactly.
I could explain everything about the ABBA repetition structure to a 5-year-old.
Okay.
They would have enough math to do it.
Whereas a smart 5-year-old, whereas an early Mozart work could withstand Schenkerian analysis to easily to show a progression across the entire piece, or maybe even over multiple movements. You could look at patterns and nested patterns over an entire work, which means the like we were saying before, the musical language is in some way designed to accommodate those big, long utterances versus something that is very, very micro at the moment. Has to be gotten right away as an earworm, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a huge topic that we really don't have time to go into, probably more, but I do think the repetition structures of pop music are very clear and simple and explainable without an awful lot of trouble to pretty much anyone. That is not true of Mozart. I cannot explain to someone who doesn't understand at least some amount of classical music theory. I can't explain to you how repetition in Mozart works, not in any kind of real detail, not and show you the patterns. And I would argue that you can hear it in Mozart, and there's other music that gets to the point where it may not be so hearable. But I want to make a point here about language then as a function, of music, which is in art music, why are these things being pushed? Like what motivates the language to develop and change over time? And the answer is, I think, that people are simply dissatisfied, or they find a way to invent or to build upon some innovation that came before them, and they want simply to see if it works. Now, it's important to note that with all the different kinds of things that one could do with rhythm, let's say, or with, we've been dwelling on harmony, but I really want to talk about rhythm too. But, well, let's talk about rhythm for a second, if we could. I'm going to interrupt myself, which is to say that in pop music, because of its function largely, rhythm has to stay really quite duple or triple, and really it's duple. I mean, because we've got 2 feet, we dance. This is what it comes from, right? And even when it's triple, it's duple, is what I would say. Even
exactly.
When it's triple, it's duple.
Like Depeche Mode all day. It's 6/8, but it's really 2, and it's 4, duple. Yeah. So, but in art music, it's not about how complex can my time signatures get, and this does not, making complex time signatures does not make your music advanced. It's about nested rhythms, quintuplets, 5 in the time of 4, perhaps, let's say. And again, you could take the math level of how to create rhythmic motifs and how to make them super complex. Someone like Frank Zappa, right? You can do this to the absolute extreme of human ability to perform and play and repeat, etc. Okay. The question isn't how complex can I get them? The question is, does it work musically? Does it provide a satisfying result? It may not be something like in a piece of pop music that you get right away and that you remember and that you can take with you and say, yeah, I'm moving back and forth to it. But it might be something a little more that you have to expose yourself to multiple times to feel, to understand the rhythm as a gesture, right? Some of the most specifically serial music it ultimately can be felt and should be, I think, heard and felt as gesture, because some of those extremely crafted rhythm and formal constructs actually feel extremely natural when they're...
I'm thinking of like a late Brahms piano music. And, those rhythmic ideas where he's putting, 5 on top of 4 all the time and sevens, he'll throw sevens in there, and these polyrhythmic things that he's doing, which are very difficult to play, which is a whole other topic. I mean, extremely difficult. You have to be, a very technically proficient and practiced musician to pull this off. But they don't sound technical. What they sound like is what you're saying. And it's just this gesture and this. You can't achieve that with duple. You can't achieve that when you're just going doom dun doom dun doom. It's impossible. That is something that you can't have in pop music. And somebody's going to come in and talk about where Radiohead puts 5 over 3 or whatever. Like and people do it. I've done it, for God's sake. But it's outside of the purpose of pop music's archetypal purpose, which is either sad reflection, or most often, let's dance.
Whereas in art music, let's take Stockhausen, right? And music. So this is 80 years old now, this concept. But the idea that you take the ratio between 2 pitches, 2 frequencies. So you take a fifth, which is actually a ratio of 3 to 2, just from a frequency point of view. If you analyze the frequencies, perfect fifth is 3 to 2, and representing that in rhythm. So 3 to 2 in rhythm is. It's 3 on one side, 2 on the other. It's hemiola. We can dance, but it gets really, really complex when you move away from the fifth, right? And so Stockhausen is an example where he worked serial processes over rhythmic rows and translated those into pitch relationships. Now, do you hear all of that necessarily? Is that something that really, I don't know, but what's important is the need to invent and to be forensic about the way that the language functions, just to try and find a new way of expressing something, that's something that art music holds. And that's why the lineage works the way it does. And the history has been largely fueled by that versus what you find in pop music. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's very fair. And I think if you're talking about inventiveness, and putting it on a scale, I think that there are certain areas where art music is demonstrably more inventive than pop music. And there are also traits and characteristics through which pop music is demonstrably more inventive than art music. And I would say timbre and texture is one of those that generally has had a lot more attention paid to it in pop music than... Well, it's hard to say more attention. I mean, certainly composers are paying attention to textures, and orchestration is an important thing. But
you're right. Our studios are a testament to this. I mean, right? Like the piano is still if you're going to write for a keyboard, you're going to go write for the piano most of the time, and you're going to use traditional techniques most of the time. Even the most advanced, innovative composers are doing this. But when it comes to pop music, you need a wealth of new gear is coming out all the time with new sounds and new techniques and new everything else, because that's the thing that's going to make the difference. It's not the scale and the mode mixture you're using, because that's really kind of borrowing very watered down versions of tricks that were popular 100, 150 years ago.
Or we're basically just still using the same blues progression that,
you don't even, exactly. So it's really, Yeah, it's really about these amazing machines that can do this stuff and perform live and react to a performer in real time, that kind of stuff. That's timbre adjustment, which is far more, I agree with you, far more important on the surface, especially in pop music, than it is in art music.
Yeah, the orchestration that you choose in popular music, so it is the primary driver of genre, is what I would say. What is the group of instruments that's playing, or at least one of the top one or two things?
It's interesting.
You know, if you have a drum set, a bass guitar, and an electric guitar, you're kind of playing rock.
Unless
you're playing jazz,
or unless you have a twangy guitar and a twangy accent, and now you're playing country music.
Right, it's a very small difference.
Mm-hmm.
but
musically, there may be no difference musically from a language point of view.
Yeah, and genre in popular music is incredibly malleable, and everything. We learned this when we had our old company Clio Music, right? And our goal was to use the software that you created to bring back similar music from a seed song, right? So here's a song. The classic example at the time in production music was, here's a Coldplay song. I can't use that because I can't afford it for my commercial. Bring me a bunch of music that sounds like Coldplay. Okay. And that sounds easy, but actually we hear tiny differences in popular music as being incredibly important if they're the right difference. So Greg mentioned...
we hear difference in timbre, for example.
Yeah. And in classical music, we don't hear it at all. And you know, like something can be incredibly... You can hear Brahms and Mozart and just people today, and this is probably more for the cultural conversation, but people today go, oh, that's the same kind of music. Oh my God, that could not be more different. But if you hear the same exact band playing the same exact song, but one of them has a pedal steel and the singer has a twang, you cannot call those the same. Even if
it's a country cover.
Yeah.
Right. It's an American country cover of Radiohead versus you can play period instruments. You can play a forte piano or a clavichord, or you can play a modern piano, and we still know it's Bach.
And I think that's where you start to turn toward culture. When you look at the differences between these two things, and you have to look very deeply at culture. And part of that is just simply that, you know, popular music has become the dominant form in our time. And so people tend to know a lot more about it. So I think we're gonna split this episode into two, because we have an awful lot to talk about on that front. So we want to look at things like culture and the music's role in culture. What are the differences there? Performance practice is a huge part of that.
And the history of this, because they are different. They are different today because they always were different. Yeah.
Yeah, performances are not the same. Classical music performances are not the same as pop music performances. We all know that, but why and how? And also the why of this music, the why of these two kinds of music. What is the impetus for creating this music and performing it and playing it and listening to it? So these are all kind of cultural questions, I think, where the conversation gets, to me, really interesting, because it gets a little muddy and hazy. So I think let's call it quits on this episode and make this a two-parter. Right. What do you think?
Yes, you got to come back to hear more if you survived this far. How about that?
Yeah, if you care about culture, you probably need to come
at
back
all. My God, how can you not?
Excellent. All right. Well, we will be back with another episode very shortly. Thanks for listening. Yes. And we'll talk to you soon.
Too much music.